The world needs more workers. That's true in general, and it's particularly true for high-income countries trying to make their economies greener. Companies in places such as the United States, Australia, and Germany are all facing challenges staffing up the kinds of sectors that are necessary to reduce carbon emissions amid a rapidly heating globe. In the next few years, there could be a global shortage of millions of workers trained for solar, wind, and other green energy jobs. There are economic repercussions of that shortfall, but it could also prevent the planet from meeting its carbon emissions goals if a lack of workers prevents countries from moving away from burning fossil fuels and other high emissions activities. Immigrants could help fill the gap. These high-income countries already rely on some number of foreign-born workers to build out renewable energy sectors, but maybe there's more work to do. From the Migration Policy Institute, this is Changing Climate, Changing Migration. I'm your host, Julian Haddam. Instead of focusing on how climate change is affecting migration, today we're asking the questions from the opposite end. Can immigrants help stop climate change? I'm speaking today with Kate Hooper. Kate is a senior policy analyst with MPI's international program, where she leads our work on labor migration. She's been doing some research with our colleague Lawrence Huang about the role of immigration in facilitating the green transition, and I am very excited to have her here on today to talk about the workers who can help us make the leap. Kate, thanks so much for your time. It's great to have you.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start by laying out the big picture. How many workers are needed to help high-income countries move to a place where their economies are at net zero carbon emissions? I guess, where are those mismatches and why have they occurred?
So, countries are setting these really ambitious targets for reducing emissions and working towards a net zero economy. So, you've got these very, very big headline pledges and targets over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But delivering on these ambitions is going to require huge investments and, in turn, lots of workers to do the things, whether that's installing solar panels or heat pumps or upgrading the electricity grid. So that's where we're seeing an emerging shortfall of workers. We know that employers in renewable energy are already really struggling to find enough workers. There was a survey in the US in 2022, which said that 80% of employers in renewables were already struggling to find enough workers for open jobs. And this is just going to get worse. You know, we're seeing more and more countries commit to these targets. We're seeing the number of green jobs growing in different sectors. And we also know that domestic workforces are getting older and more people are retiring. So even now we're seeing some of these shortages emerge, and we know that they're just going to get bigger and bigger. There was a BCG study which tried to put a number on that, which is obviously a very challenging exercise, but they reckon that by 2030, there's going to be a shortfall of 7 million green workers. So we're talking about potentially a really huge gap.
And that's internationally, or that's just in the US?
That's internationally.
Yeah.
That's internationally.
And so eventually, I assume the goal or a goal is to have a native-born workers who can fill these roles. Is immigration seen as kind of a temporary stopgap measure that can help us get to that bridge place? Or, I mean, what is the role of immigration and immigrants in that situation that you described?
So training local workers is going to be key, and that really needs to be at the heart of efforts to plan for the green transition. But I think immigration fits into the picture in a couple of different ways. So one is just volume of workers. In most high income countries, workforces are shrinking because more and more people are getting older and they're retiring. And so the overall workforce is getting smaller and smaller. And so there's a question just about where you source all of the workers. So even as you invest in training programs to help local workers upskill, reskill, there's still that shortfall of trainees. And that's one place where I think immigration may come into the picture, especially for some high income countries. Another place is just sort of timeline and urgency. The challenge with this is that some of these green jobs don't actually have a very long lead time to train workers for. So taking the example of someone installing solar panels, that actually only takes a few weeks to learn how to do that. So that's actually a very short lead time. But some of these other jobs require a much longer lead time. And if you're a country that, say, has pledged to reduce your emissions by 2/3 by 2030, you've got a lot of work to do over the next 6 years. And so, even as you're investing in training local workers for some of these jobs, you may need to source trained workers from other countries to help fill immediate shortfalls, even as you're sort of investing in training. So, I think it's partly a numbers game. It's also partly a finding skills and time game. And so I think immigration needs to happen alongside these really important investments in training.
That brings me to something I'm very interested in, which is that you research labor migration in general, and the need for foreign workers to meet labor force demands in high income countries is not new. That we can see a similar story in software engineers and healthcare and lots of other sectors. But I guess I'm curious about what is different or unique about the green transition. And it seems like, the urgency you talk about is one, right? Is that just the product of these kind of deadlines of, we have to we've committed to reduce carbon emissions by X% by 2030. And so there's time is running out. What's unique about the green transition, green jobs compared to other sectors that you also look at?
So you're right in it. It's not the only sector that's experiencing shortages or the only sector that we expect demand to grow. I mean, that's the case, for example, in healthcare, lots of different sectors across the economy. But I think it's marked out by the scale and also the urgency. We're just seeing the demand for green jobs taking off and over a very, very short timeline. So I think that's sort of what makes this sector fairly unique. I also think it's an interesting illustration. So it's a scenario where the green transition is creating a lot of new jobs, but it's also potentially leading to a number of job losses at the same time. So while we're seeing green jobs being created, the sort of flip side of that is that some jobs in more polluting sectors are going away. And so there's a sort of tension between needing to invest in training and source workers for the green transition, while also making sure that workers who get displaced from, brown jobs is the shorthand for those jobs in more polluting sectors. Making sure that workers in brown jobs who might lose their employment in the next, few months, few years, also have a way to access decent green jobs as well. So it's a really challenging situation where there's going to be a lot of flux. There's a lot of demand. There are a lot of workers who will potentially also be looking for opportunities, and so making sure that there's an effort to connect up immigration discussions with investments in training, with support for immigrant integration to make sure that new arrivals can access these jobs, and connecting all the pieces of the puzzle together.
And so it sounds like you're saying also that there is some number of immigrants who work in these brown jobs, quote unquote, which I guess is what heavy industry, like natural resources, fracking, like oil and gas, and that there's a concern about them losing their jobs too. And kind of transitioning there as well. Is that a fair that's a description?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I
Yeah.
mean, not just immigrants. We don't have great data on the share of foreign-born nationals working in brown jobs for a number of fairly technical reasons. We certainly know sort of anecdotally that there are immigrants working in sectors like oil and gas, mining, all these different areas that will potentially be phased out as, countries move towards clean energy sources. And so yes, that's a really big part of the puzzle, is how do you help this workforce also access opportunities in the green economy, and how do you make sure that opportunities for training are open to all? So that includes people from other countries who are now living in their destination country. It also includes people who might have been out of the workforce for a while, various different sort of disadvantaged communities. So thinking about ways that training to help meet green economy needs are open to as many workers as possible, and have lots of different on ramps to help different people, access this training at different stages of their career.
So I guess I wonder, to what extent is the problem here either a shortage of workers, just not enough people, B, a shortage of training, like we have the people, but we need to put them in the right direction, or C, a failure to kind of adequately recognize and credential workers who have the training in their origin country, but it doesn't transfer over. I guess, in other words, to what extent is there a concern about so-called brain drain that might lead, engineers to be working as rideshare drivers and to lift that up? Can you talk about the mix of those three kind of different subsets of the problem, if that makes sense?
So I'm going to cop out and say I think it's all three.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Sorry. So I do think that it's a bit of a mixture. Like I think that there are shortages of workers. I think that in some cases, training is just not at the scale needed yet. So that's
Mm,
another dynamic. And then, as you say, in more regulated professions, there's a dynamic where immigrants don't have all of their skills and experience recognized, and so they can't put it to use. I mean, to sort of give you a concrete example, one area where we do have fairly good data on is Australia's engineering workforce. And
hmm.
it's something like a third of all foreign-born workers there felt that they didn't have their experience fully recognized and that they were underemployed. So,
Oh, wow.
they had all this training, all of this experience, but they weren't able to fully use it in their job. We know that immigrants are already an important part of the clean energy workforce and the engineering workforce, but if you're missing that opportunity to really help, immigrants put their skills to use, there's a sort of wasted potential there that is really important. So I think it's a sort of combination of all three. When it comes to green jobs, some of these jobs are regulated, so would need a license to practice,
Hmm.
and some aren't. So for the former group, that's really important to get your credentials recognized because you'll then need to sort of sit an exam, get a local license to practice. Without that, you just can't do your job. So when we're talking about green jobs that require that license, so it might be an electrician, a plumber, an engineer, that sort of thing. Without that process in place, an immigrant can't take up that job. So even if you're an engineer with 20 years of experience, unless you go through the formal process to get your credentials recognized, you just can't apply your skills in the same way. But there are lots of other green jobs where you may not need that license to practice. And so that's where there may be a little need for local experience or training to sort of appeal to local employers, but that's a bit more flexible. So some of these jobs will be regulated and have that sort of that barrier, and then others, the barriers might be a little bit more subtle. It might be a language barrier, it might be a difficulty, sort of convincing an
Mm.
employer that your previous experience correlates to what they need now. But it's a little bit more so discretionary.
What, if anything, are governments and perhaps trade organizations, credentialing organizations doing? I mean, are there efforts to do this kind of credentialing, expansion of credentialing that you talk about? Are there new visas for various green energy jobs? I don't know. I mean, what policies have governments sought to tackle this labor force need?
So I think that the answer is that immigration and immigrant integration has been a bit overlooked in the green transition so far.
Hmm.
So the UK had a green transition document from a couple of years ago that went through the green workforce, identifying needs and shortages, and there was not a single mention of immigration in the entire thing. And I think that just speaks to how these responses are a bit segmented by different ministries. So
Hmm.
I think you have the climate ministries working on the green transition. They're thinking about the workforce, but I think that immigration and immigrant integration is still a bit overlooked. There's some evidence that that's beginning to change. We know, for example, that Australia has a national energy workforce strategy that they're working on, and skilled immigration is part of that discussion. You're seeing sort of piecemeal responses I mean, one example is South Korea has just expanded a visa program for workers in power line transmission. So,
Hmm.
but that's, a few hundred people. So there's sort of little bits of action here and there, but I don't think we've fully seen that sort of whole of government thinking about the green transition where immigration is thought of as part of the sort of workforce strategy, and in turn that immigrant integration is thought of as part of the workforce strategy. Because if you're trying to source local workers, you need to be making sure that all of your workers already in the country are working, that they're being able to put their skills to full use. And I'm not sure yet that that's really happening on the scale that it needs to be happening.
That's a great segue to my next question, which is about this kind of interaction and intersection between foreign born workers and native born workers, which is basically often, as you know very well, when you talk about bringing a demand for foreign born workers in various industries, you very quickly get to a concern from some corners that immigrant workers will undercut the native born workforce and drive down wages, and that hurts native workers. Is that a discussion here? And so is that a factor in this discussion, either politically or in reality? What's that dynamic like?
I don't think it's a big framing yet, which is interesting. I think one element is that there's such a clear need for workers in the green transition, that you don't have that same sense of competition for scarce opportunities that occurs in other sectors. But I do think that it's a risk that governments need to be aware of and manage proactively going forward. So I think one challenge, as we've been discussing, is that governments have to, on the one hand, think about ambitious migration pathways that can meet immediate needs while also investing in large scale training programs for local workers. And so I think governments need to make sure that they're doing both and that they're communicating effectively that they're doing both at the same time, especially as we see some people potentially losing their jobs as part of this green transition towards cleaner energy sources as well. So I think that that's something that we know tensions can flare if there's a push for immigration while local workers are losing their jobs or unable to access new opportunities. So I think that's something that governments need to be very aware of and very proactive about as well. I also think that as we're seeing these new green jobs being created, it's really an opportunity for governments to be proactive in working with civil society on, creating decent jobs. Another element that often comes to the fore is that there are concerns about downward pressure on pay, on working conditions in these sort of essential but low paid jobs. And I think that government can work with, unions, with civil society to get out ahead of this and sort of work with the private sector and say, well, if we're going to proactively work towards decent working conditions, higher pay, that dynamic becomes a bit less important. I think it's where we see that sort of downward pressure, poor regulation, poor oversight. That's often where that dynamic comes out because workers are being played off against each other. Whereas if this is part of a conversation about how to make sure that these jobs offer decent working conditions, that contract jobs are able to sort of connect up and there's oversight to make sure that workers still have benefits, those sorts of things. This is an area where there's so much innovation and so much job creation happening. I think that it's another example where getting out ahead of this potential risk is really important to make sure that some of the tensions that are played out in other sectors don't happen here.
I'm also curious about the impact on origin countries. I mean, if, for example, if all of India's solar engineers leave India and come to Australia, the UK, the US, then who will be left behind to help build solar panels in India? You see similar versions of this story playing out with sectors like healthcare, where people from the Philippines or the Caribbean or whatever are trained to become nurses. They go abroad, but then there's concerns about a hollowing out of the local healthcare sector, what's referred to as brain drain often. Is that something that we should worry about too, especially because, fighting climate change is not just a concern for high income countries, although high income countries tend to be disproportionate climate emitters?
I think it's definitely a risk. As you say, governments are all trying to achieve these ambitious green transition goals on similar timelines. And so there is a risk that, a solar panel technician knows that they can earn 10 times the salary in another country. That's hard to compete with or argue with. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that there probably are going to be some tensions around, where workers go, making sure that sort of immigration efforts don't come at the cost of other countries as well. I think there are a couple of different steps that can be taken. I think one is having good oversight of where workers are being recruited from and having those sort of intergovernmental conversations as they go. So, there might be ways to sort of put safeguards in place if we know that all of these solar panel technicians, for example, are leaving a country. Are there ways to sort of slow down that flow or to sort of encourage recruitment from a number of different countries? So I think on the demand sort of end of the spectrum, that's one step that could be explored. But I
Which
think
happens in other sectors now. I mean, that's not a
it
brand new
does.
idea. Yeah, like
It
healthcare in
does.
particular, nurses. Yeah.
It happens in healthcare, for example. It's not perfect. We've seen these negotiations happen around healthcare, but the reality is that, with some private recruiters, some nurses still slip through. But it is an example of how governments can work together on sort of ethical standards around recruitment practices and trying to tackle this issue of brain drain when it does happen. So I think that's something to explore. It's certainly more complicated when it comes to green jobs because green jobs are quite a fluffy category. For our conversation, we're often actually talking about sort of clean energy, but green jobs are across the economy. So there are lots of sort of definitional questions about, which green jobs are we talking about? does that definition in one country line up with how another country thinks about green jobs? So I think it's quite a tough exercise, but I certainly think it's something worth exploring, especially because we know that demand is just going to shoot up and up. But I think it's also a sort of other end of the scale. I think it's also potentially an opportunity. I think that while discussions around brain drain sometimes think about limiting opportunities, another way to frame it is that this might be an opportunity to sort of think about investing in a global talent pool for some of these jobs. There's a lot of money being funneled into the green transition. And so what happens if some of that goes into training workers in lower income countries to access green jobs, either at home or in another country? There aren't great guidelines yet around training standards, but that's an opportunity to potentially develop international standards. So, for some of these new green jobs that are emerging, can you develop training modules that employers are willing to recognize across multiple countries? And so you're investing in a talent pool that may move for work, may come back and work in their country of origin, but you're training at a scale and you're investing at a scale that, you're increasing the overall supply of workers. So it becomes less about a competition for finite workers and more about sort of saying, well, let's work together to invest in workers at home and overseas, acknowledging that some of those workers will move for opportunities across different countries, but that this doesn't actually have to be as much of a zero-sum game as some fear it might be.
And that's, you're talking about a complementarity there, both of origin and destination countries, and also between destination countries, right? So that like the US, Canada, Germany, whatever, are not outbidding each other or undercutting each other for the same exact workers.
Exactly. I think that with some cooperation and with some sort of, lined up investment, there's an opportunity to think about this as a way to sort of expand the talent pool and expand opportunities to move in a way that isn't simply one country trying to undercut another country at their expense.
We probably have to wrap things up there, but this has been a great conversation. Kate, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Julian.
Kate Hooper is a senior policy analyst with MPI's international program. Her policy brief with Lawrence Wong on this topic is called The Role of Immigrant Workers in the Green Transition. You can find it on MPI's website at migrationpolicy.org. Thanks for tuning in to Changing Climate, Changing Migration. Catch every one of our new episodes as soon as they are released by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your audio content. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and all the other major services. If you might have missed an episode, you can check out our archives online at migrationpolicy.org/podcasts. While you're there, subscribe to the Migration Information Source newsletter to get fresh updates about migration trends and data from all over the world. You can also follow MPI on social media to stay on top of the newest publications, short reads, and events. Feel free to reach out to me directly by sending me an email. I'm at source@migrationpolicy.org, and I'm always happy to hear feedback and ideas for new episodes. This episode was produced by Daniela Espacio with editorial oversight from Michelle Middlestat and assistance from Lisa Dixon. Our theme music is Touch by Patrick Patricios. I'm Julian Haddam, and I'll see you next time.